what are some rights that you'd like to highlight for parents when they are trying to advocate for their child at school?
Sure. So you have a right to the data, and data is information that's supposed to be collected on your child. Your child cannot have any goals, cannot have any measurement of progress of goals unless there is data being collected. So you have the right to see the actual data that's been collected, not just the educator's summary of the data, but the actual data, meaning there are oftentimes, and again, not because teachers are terrible people, but that teachers don't take specific data, but they'll just say, well, it's time to fill out my progress reports on Tommy. Has he gotten better at handwriting? Well, I'd say a little bit. And they'll just summarize. And what happens is we miss those trends, we miss things that are super important, that specific data. So, real IEP data would say something like 3 out of 4 times, Tommy will use appropriate grip without prompting. And, that's a handwriting grip. There's a specific word for it. I don't know. Versus like, a fist grasp. And you have the right to request that data. And a lot of times when you request it, you'll see like this, sure, sure, sure. And you're like, and not a summarization of the data, like the actual data. And you'll see this kind of like deer in headlights moment. And they're like, yeah, yeah, not a problem. I can get that to you in about 3 weeks ish. And you'll notice that the data that's been collected is the previous 3 weeks. So they just needed the time to collect it. And
That's a
again,
little
I know
too
everyone's doing their
familiar.
best. That's not really what I'm here to argue about, whether you're doing your best or not. I'm here to make sure my child gets their civil rights. You also have the right to have other people in your meeting. So anyone that has special knowledge of your child, so obviously your spouse, your partner, it could also be a grandparent, it could also be a friend. So a lot of times when you are in an IEP setting, if you're like me and your spouse happens to work during the day, it's literally just you and then this entire room of professionals who are in their job who, have probably kind of pre-gamed a little bit and talked to each other about, well, in this meeting, we're going to talk about this. We're really trying to avoid giving them that one-to-one aid. So if we can kind of get her off that idea that Tommy really needs that one, then as we only have 3 aides to go around the whole school right now, and no one's applying, so we can't get Tommy another aide.
That one hits
And then
way
we as
too
a
close to
parent,
home.
right?
Yeah,
Hey,
that's
I
literally
get it.
what
You
we've
got
been
this
working
whole thing
on.
to try to figure out, right? And so
Hmm.
you go in as a parent, and unless you know your rights, and not only know them, but know them well enough to make people feel a little uncomfortable. And not uncomfortable by being inappropriate, but uncomfortable by disagreeing. And you think of how lawyers and judges and attorneys talk to each other in meetings or in examinations when they're questioning a witness. And it's very direct, right? The verbiage that they're using is so important. You can't fluff around things. And what's tricky is that, like in American English, we fluff around things all the time. And I know a lot of my autistic friends are just like, can people just like talk straight? Like,
Oh,
if you
yes.
say, hey, you want to go to lunch? And I'm like, not really interested in lunch. And I'm like, nah. And that suddenly you're like offended. I'm confused because what just happened here? And how did we get in a fight? And then the neurotypical person's like, you don't want to hang out with me and you hate me. And the other person's like, I didn't feel like going to lunch. And that's, we take that kind of conversation out of legal conversations. And so I know for myself, I've learned to speak legally, which is very kindly, always appropriately. I never get super heated or animated or even very emotional. I'm very specific about my verbiage. I go in there knowing what verbiage I need to get on the record, certain things I need them to say, whether it's the school nurse or whether it's the teacher. And then once I get that on record, I know, okay, I've just gotten this violation on record. this is another thing that can show my son's free and appropriate public education is not being served to him at this location. But again, a lot of times people aren't used to that kind of, I don't know, just be positive attitude.
So,
Like, don't
what would you
complain, you know? It's like, ah, that's not what I'm doing.
so what would you tell, I guess, parents, what technique or buzzwords, or what do you think that they should do in terms of approaching an IEP meeting when they feel unheard in that meeting? Because I know, like, for
Sure.
me, for example, I'll go to IEP meetings. I know my rights. I'm talking to them. I'm trying to tell them, like, what I know my kid needs. And they're always coming up with some sort of, like, excuse, or not quite saying no, but also not saying yes, and then trying to give a reason as to why that might take time to consider. I think you probably know the dance I'm talking
Yeah.
about.
And I think that's where the not super direct language really fails us. Um, is because, like I said, they pre-gamed and they have an idea of what's going on. So some of the verbiage that I would use is FAPE, free appropriate public education. As soon as you start talking about FAPE or free appropriate public education, their little antennas should start kind of whirring and saying like, oh, they're talking about like rights. We're talking legal. We're not talking about what you would like him to have. You're talking about what they're legally entitled to as a child that lives in the United States. We're talking legal stuff so that they get a little more careful, and so they're not going to say, um, I've gotten a lot of messages from parents where an administrator or a teacher will say, oh yeah, we don't do one-to-one aids here. And I'm like, did you get that on record? That's always usually my follow-up question. Oh, did you get that on record? Because if you did, you've got all the evidence you need that this is not the appropriate placement, or that they're making uninformed false statements where if the child requires a one-to-one aid, they get a one-to-one aid. That's like saying that this child in a wheelchair, oh, we don't do wheelchair ramps here. So, and
Yeah,
just
that was
expecting that to
actually
be like, okay, I guess they
that
don't
was
do ramps
actually
here. So
very similar to sorry. I think that
no,
that was actually very similar to what was going on with us. Like, we have been struggling with our eldest, who is supposed to have like supervision on the playground equipment because she has hypotonia and other issues, and
mm-hmm.
she's gotten hurt 4 different times already, including a head injury, and they were not able to tell us what happened because for that split second they looked away. And so I'm just
Aha.
like a bit frustrated because I'm like, okay, that's a violation of the IEP.
Yeah.
If you
And do you have
didn't
that?
look, that
Just
means they
this
weren't
is exactly what I
supervised.
do in a consultation. Like, do you have that documented that they're like, I looked away for a split second? Or did
Yeah, and of
they
course that's not
verbally
documented.
converse
They're
that
not
to you?
gonna yes, the verbally, they're not gonna document that they did something wrong.
So
So like that's the
sometimes
part that I feel like is hard.
sometimes when that happens and it's a fresh experience, I'll tell the person, go back. Send them an email that just says, hey, I just wanted to make sure I understood you correctly today, where you said that you had looked away for a moment. And that's when Mackenzie, I don't know, bonked her head. I just want to make sure I understood that correctly. And if they were like, yes, that's accurate, then you have it on record that that's what happened. If you're like, oh, dang, we didn't get it written down, then it won't happen. But there are ways to follow up. And I follow up every phone conversation with, I just want to make sure I understood. Depending on whoever you're working with, the amount of time you feel like they may have, thoroughness, whatever, I would summarize it myself, what I understood, and then check with them, because sometimes they don't have time to put in all the effort to rewrite everything that they have told you. So sometimes they're a little more appreciative, cooperative if you're like, did I understand this correctly? And if they say yes, it's on record that yes, I did look away when that happened. And then you have violation 1, 2, 3, 4. And again, those violations get taken up. And it's not necessarily that that means that teacher did something wrong. What that may mean is that teacher has too many other responsibilities. It may mean that that teacher requires additional training. It may mean that that teacher requires additional personnel or people within her group of responsibility sharing, that she can say, hey, I'm getting a phone call from da 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 da. Can you watch Angela for 5 minutes? So that's not necessarily to say, okay, teacher, you failed. That's to say, whatever the plan is, we're not getting all of our bases covered. So this is
Yeah.
evidence that not all of our bases are getting covered. But people tend to take that personally.
Yeah, unfortunately, I feel like IEP meetings feel more personal than they probably should feel. But I know
Right.
like that's definitely been our experience because like we're in a rural area and so the resources are very limited. And I totally feel for these teachers. Like
Right.
there are not enough aides to go around. There's not enough staff to go around. There's way too many kids. Like our kids at our school, they actually shuffle them around a bunch of different buildings and facilities that aren't
Mm,
even on the school campus because there's not enough room. So like I totally get it. But at the same time, I have to be advocating and on the lookout for my child's safety. Like if my kid is getting
of
head
course.
injuries or things like that. So like that I think is like that delicate and frustrating dance when it comes to the IEPs is like we know our kids need to be protected regardless of whether or not those resources are there. Like each child when they're in a school system, each special education child is tied to funding and that funding
Right.
goes to the school. So
Right.
by default, that resource is there. It's just like where is it
Right.
being allocated?
Right. Well, and some of the verbiage, back to the original question that you had asked, some of the verbiage again that may be helpful, apart from FAPE legal verbiage, would be, yeah, that's not acceptable. Like that's pretty finalizing. That's not just saying, I'm not sure that I agree with that. Or, there's so much wiggle room and grayish. But if you say, I find that unacceptable. I don't feel that that would be an individualized education program for my child or an appropriate educational program for my child. Or, I disagree with that summarization. I feel that the data, and always reference the data. If you, for example, if you're in a debate team, I was going to say debate team. Obviously, I should not be in a debate team. If you're in a debate team and you're spitting out referenced facts, AKA evidence, versus, well, in my opinion, like seagulls are the best birds. So, you know, take it. But if
Well, it would
you're
be weird
saying
for you
in the
to say
meeting,
that in a meeting.
seagulls, I don't know,
Yeah.
and here I am being like, this is what you should say in a meeting, seagulls. And they're
Seagulls.
like,
Got
this
it.
lady doesn't even know what she's saying. If you were to say, which would be more convincing as far as we better get on this, this is the fire that we need to put out. It appears to me, let me phrase that. If you look at, I've provided for you on March 3rd, I was called because the school told me, quote, he is too upset and we are unsure of what to do. And on March 5th, I was asked to pick him up as well. The report that came back, I have that out for you, talks about how he was triggered by a fire alarm that went off. And, in his IEP, we have that we let them know that fire alarms are going to happen and they are given their headphones. That's not what happened in this case. And so I'm presenting this list of evidence versus, well, I just don't think that's fair.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like those
One
are
is clearly going to win.
totally different approaches. One is, these are the facts of the case, quote unquote case. And one is like, I don't know, like, I just don't like it. One's just an opinion. So in a court, evidence wins and is money for the district, and they would rather give you the money up front and allocate the resources up front than have it be on the backside of a lawsuit that they lose. And every lawsuit that they lose is like a ding to their accreditation. And so that's really important to them. So they definitely don't want that to happen. But again, if you're a parent who just listens to people within the school system that have very good intentions say, well, I'm sorry, this is all we can do. And you just say, well, I guess that's all they can do. and that's it, then sure, there will be no change. And it blows my mind that people think that's the solution, that we just need to be grateful for what we can get, even though everybody is miserable. That should be how we handle the situation, rather than, I understand that gathering data and showing deficiencies within public education isn't super comfortable for everybody, but I'm also going to get that teacher the support that they need by proving they don't have enough assistance or have enough resources. They're, for example, some things to ask about are the background education and licensing of each person on your child's IEP team. Legally, one person, at least one person, needs to have a special education background license or certification, which seems like duh, but there are a lot of times where that is not the case. And then wouldn't it is here, I'm using super intense sarcasm here, if you can't tell. Shocking when people who don't have a special education background, license, or education deal with children with various disabilities. It's almost like they don't know what they're doing. I know. It's crazy. It's crazy. And they'll just be like, well, I asked him to stop and he didn't. And you're like, he can't, what do you mean he
Yeah.
can't hold still? Like, he literally can't hold still. Like, well, he
Yeah.
fidgets a lot. And I'm like, oh, and
That's
is
part of
there a
it.
problem? And what's the
Yeah.
problem?
Yeah, I've
Uh,
definitely experienced that where like when my kid had like their first experience at a public education system, they had this kind of like red green system of like behavior, and my kid was getting dinged for like red behaviors for things like running away when they are elopement risk and it's on their IEP, or like things like volume control of like shouting or whatever with their voice. I'm like,
yeah.
they're autistic. That's part of interoception. Like,
Yeah.
so it's frustrating because the teacher actually is like a special needs teacher, but I think maybe the they're not keeping up with their what are they called, CEUs or
See
things like
you,
that. I don't.
sure.
Yeah, I don't really know. It could just be the school doesn't have enough resources. They're overwhelmed. They're burnt out. Like I can empathize with all of that, but at the end of the day, I have to look out for my kid.
Right. Well, and something that I've said before is that, the deficiencies within the public education system should not lie on the shoulders of my child's civil rights. So, look, I get that there are deficiencies. That's what I am making apparent, that it's my child with a disability that has to just like kind of put up and shut up. Out of all the people involved in this part, the most vulnerable person is the one. No, 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 no. And sometimes like we don't think about it that way. Like we all think about, but what about me? But the whole educational system is set up for each individual child. That's who we're here for.